Welcome to Let's Hear It.
Let's Hear It is a podcast for and about the field of foundation and nonprofit communications, produced by its two co-hosts, Eric Brown and Kirk Brown. No relation.
Well said, Eric, and I'm Kirk.
And I'm Eric.
The podcast is sponsored by the Communications Network and the Lumina Foundation.
We're talking to people about their work and what's happening in the field with the hopes of making this growing arena just a little bit more accessible to us all.
You can find Let's Hear It on any podcast subscription platform. You can find us on Twitter at Let's Hear It Cast, and you can email us at hello@letshearitcast.com.
Let us know if you have any thoughts about what you hear today, including people we should have on the show.
And if you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts so that more people can find us.
So let's get on to the show.
And we're back. It's a new year. It's a new podcast. It's a new interview. And it's a new Mr. Brown that I'm seeing across the interview process here.
Same old Mr. Brown. Hi,
Welcome
Kirk.
to Let's Hear It. How's it going?
You know, the world is upside down, but we're muddling through.
Well, you mentioned this in the interview we're about to hear, which I'll have you set up in a moment, but we do hearts go out to all the people being affected by what's going on. Total chaos, total craziness, and God help us all is all I have to say. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, well, no, I agree. Let's hope for the best.
So tell us what we've got here today, because this is, once again, another really good one on Let's Hear It.
Yeah, I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I spoke with Aaron Belkin, who is the founder of the Palm Center, which is a think tank that Aaron created to get the military to undo its "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" policy back in the 80s, and actually in the early 90s, and since then, the Palm Center has continued on its really incredible work, and Aaron was one of the architects of this strategy to get the United States government to undo "Don't Ask, Don't Tell" and to allow gays and lesbians to serve openly and freely in the military. And Aaron is just the most, what's the word? Energetic, enthusiastic, intelligent strategist of communications, politics, and anything else you can think of that I've ever met. He's amazing. He's just amazing.
And for anybody who takes for granted some of the rights work that's been done, back in the day, the notion of gays and lesbians serving in the military would have been viewed as, what would you say, Eric?
A joke. I mean, okay, no, I take it back. They were serving in the military. They just were not allowed to do so openly. And
acknowledge it.
And the military would use someone's homosexuality as an excuse to drum them out. And many thousands upon thousands of service people were drummed out of the military, and obviously it had a terrible effect on the military, as Aaron was able to prove. Not the least of which was when there were the linguists who were Arabic speakers were kicked out of the military for being gay, and therefore there were untold messages that went undecoded in the advance of 9/11. So really good example. And this was one of the many pieces of research that he pursued in order to make the case that this notion that gays and lesbians would affect unit cohesion was a lie.
Yeah, the word I was going to use was impossible, because this would have been perceived as an impossible task when Aaron got started. So Aaron Belkin is the director of the Palm Center, which you can find online at palmcenter.org. Aaron has his own website at aaronbelkin.org, where you can see his books, including How He Won, which is the ebook you reference in the interview we're about to hear. And you can find Aaron on Twitter at Aaron Belkin. Let's listen, and then we'll come back. Eric, thank you for doing this. This is a great interview. This is Aaron Belkin on Let's Hear It.
Welcome to Let's Hear It. My guest today is Aaron Belkin. He is a scholar, an author, an activist, and a dancer. And Aaron was a key strategist in the successful effort to get the United States to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy in the United States military. He's the founding director of the Palm Center, which the Advocate named as one of the most effective LGBTQ rights organizations in the nation. He's a professor of political science at San Francisco State University, where he teaches a lecture course on delusion and paranoia in American politics. And also, I just found out, the politics of Harry Potter. I really want to go to San Francisco State. And he's also a truly amazing guy, one of the smartest communication strategists I've ever met. I mean that sincerely. And actually, I should also note, Aaron, that we are having this conversation right now as bombs are falling in the Ukraine. The world is increasingly becoming a challenging, if it could get any more challenging. I just wanted to note that it's a difficult day and a difficult week in a difficult, I don't know, millennium. But thank you for joining us.
I agree that it's terrible. Today it's been terrible for a long time. I guess terrible in new ways today, but it's a pleasure to be here.
I just wanted to start off with you were in the middle of the fight to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was seemingly one of the most Sisyphean goals to take on the U.S. military. Can you just help us understand how this came about? What was your thinking? How did this, and then we'll get into the strategy as well. But look, why did you take on the U.S. military? That seems like an interesting way to start.
Well, when I was coming out of the closet in the early 90s, that is when President Clinton was trying to lift the military's ban on gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, and he failed to do that. But during the course of that fight, opponents said terribly violent, disrespectful, painful things, even on the floor of Congress. And so I was in grad school at the time, and so that was really at the forefront of my mind. I was also studying the military as part of my graduate program. So the question of military service by gays, lesbians, and bisexuals was really kind of at the intersection of my interests. But I'll also say that I went to college when our university was led by a president named Howard Swearer, who was very focused on the ways in which knowledge could be used, not just to talk to other scholars, but also to help inform public policy. And so when I became a professor, I wanted to not just produce research for academic consumption, but to try to use research to inform public policy. So it was really the combination of those things.
The military seems like that's a daunting place to start. You might have started on marriage equality in some states, for example, or if the idea was to help the world be a more hospitable place for gays, lesbians, and transgender people, as you've also expanded that work. Why the military? What was that? Where did you? What do you think what was the strategy there?
I'd always been interested in the military. When I was a kid, I had like a model airplane museum in our attic, and then I started studying the military as an undergraduate and really never stopped. And my doctoral dissertation was, the field was political science and international relations, but effectively it was military studies. And I guess just as a young adult, my kind of question that I was asking is why would anyone ever join an organization where they would have to potentially kill someone or expose themselves to the risk of death? And that is a central question of military studies. But then later in life, I became much more of an anti-militarist, not so much anti-military in terms of concerns about the military as an organization, although there is that, but maybe even more importantly, concerns about the militarization of American culture and the damage it does domestically and globally when citizens worship military ideas uncritically. And so that's just been kind of a through line of my professional life. And it's, you talked about marriage equality. I mean, the folks doing marriage equality work for, more than 3 decades had a really steep climb the whole way. And so that wouldn't have been easy work, but it's also not where, I didn't really have any expertise or value that I could add there, whereas on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I had some, a little bit of experience and expertise and kind of context that helped me start that conversation.
You had said that being part of the military is one of these tenets of American democracy or American participation, and that people who are gay were being told that they didn't belong. Can you talk a little more about that?
Well, if you look at kind of studies of citizenship going back 1,000 years, the marker of first-class citizens is pretty much always whether someone can enter into contracts and whether they can serve in the military. And especially in a highly militarized society like our own, when a group of people is banned from the military, it's all but impossible to lock in citizenship rights in other realms. And so opponents of gays and lesbians in the military, I would argue, didn't really care about military readiness or the military. They wanted to ban gays and lesbians, and they were exactly right. They wanted to ban gays and lesbians and bisexuals from the military because they knew that if they got away with that, it would be much easier to deprive gays, lesbians, and bisexuals of rights, marriage equality or the right to teach in schools or all kinds of rights. And so, there are other really, really important questions about the well-being of service members, about the effectiveness of the military. But I agree with the anti-gay forces that controlling military policy in a way that harms gays and lesbians does great damage outside of the military.
Now, you wrote this really, really smart book, taking apart or kind of going into the strategy that you helped to employ in removing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And it's a book. It's an ebook. It's available on wherever you get your books for $5. Everyone has $5. You should get the book. It's called How We Won. And I want to have a conversation about basically the 5 strategies that you talk about in this book. And I really, really encourage anybody to read it because you can apply this to so many other things. Just the kind of sharpness of thinking is out of control. Your first tenet here was target the opposition's lies. And so we learn in communications kindergarten never to repeat the message of the opposition, even if you're trying to debunk it. Do you agree?
I think that's bullshit. I think so. There's a Berkeley professor named George Lakoff. I think he's still at Berkeley. I believe he did great damage to progressive politics about 15 years ago when he published a book urging progressives to focus more on framing. And there was an example of the Bush administration had proposed a bill to basically, it was a giveaway to the oil, gas, and coal industry, and they called it the Clear Skies Initiative. And so Lakoff's point was look, as soon as the other side framed their bill as the Clear Skies Initiative, they won. And so progressives need to get slick about their framing and need to be as slick as conservatives are about their framing. So we should, never repeat negative messages, but also never use the other side's frame. And the problem with that is that, and I would argue that progressives have overlearned, in very counterproductive and dangerous ways, have overlearned that message. And I'll elaborate a little bit on that in a minute. But the problem with that is that, Republicans and conservatives need to lie and slickly frame their policies because their policies are designed to injure people. Their policies, without exception, are designed to injure scapegoats and or to help plutocrats, which means injuring everyone who's not a plutocrat. And so, of course, they have to lie about their policies and frame things in disingenuous ways. But the strength of progressive politics is that we want to help people, and that's the truth of what we want to do. And you might say, oh, well, duh, that's obvious, no big deal. But it's not obvious, and I would argue that progressives are afraid of the truth of our own policies. And let's just take the simplest example, taxes. What it means to be a progressive is to believe in big government and high taxes. But how many progressive groups have worked to give Democratic politicians cover with the message that high taxes are a good thing? You might say, high taxes are a good thing. No, that's terrible. We could never frame things that way. Well, that's right. We could never frame things that way because we haven't done the decades of public education work that needs to be done to educate the public that government is good and that high taxes are good. You got to say that. You have to say high taxes are a good thing. You can't frame your way out of that with bullshit. And so on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we used the other side's frame. When I came into the Don't Ask, Don't Tell conversation, the conversation was like this. opponents of gays and lesbians in the military were saying that gays and lesbians hurt the military. And the most important thing is the lives of our service members. And so, yeah, it sucks to ban a group of people from the military, but, we can't risk our service members' lives, and gays and lesbians undermine readiness and unit cohesion. And the response of my community was, that's unfair and anti-democratic and inconsistent with American values. And I thought that framing was not going to work, because I could see that if any politician ever stepped forward to argue that Don't Ask, Don't Tell should be repealed, as long as generals and admirals with a straight face could say that gays and lesbians hurt the military, then no politician could ever prevail on Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal. So there were a lot of things that needed to happen to get Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal across the line, including lobbying and litigation and grassroots advocacy. But my sense when I entered the conversation in, I guess, about late 1998, so 5 years after the policy had been put in place and about 12 years before it would be repealed, was that we had to win on the other side's argument. So let's use their frame. Okay, they want to talk about military readiness, fine, but let's use research to show. So the other side was lying about military readiness, and the research show that inclusion actually helps the military. So let's make that argument that based on research, inclusion helps the military, and it's discrimination that hurts the military. So we repeated the negative message. We used the other side's frame, but over time, we prevailed on our message, and that opened up a space for litigators and lobbyists and grassroots activists to push the policy across the line.
And so you started the Palm Center, I think at the time it was at UC Santa Barbara, as a research center, among other things, but a research center that gave you the opportunity to conduct the kind of research, to put the lie to the fact that gays in the military affects unit cohesion, among other things. And again, we learn in communications kindergarten that facts don't really matter. We have to tell stories. We have to appeal to emotions. But you spent a lot of time doing research and putting out facts. Why did facts matter?
Well, facts mattered because we needed to suck the oxygen out of the Pentagon's lie that gays and lesbians hurt the military. And in order to suck the oxygen out of that argument, we had to show through research that the argument was wrong. But, the research already showed that, and I want to step back, Palm Center is, we're still up and running. We're a think tank. We are a think tank. We were a think tank. For as long as we run, we will remain a think tank. And we publish our research in state-of-the-art peer-reviewed journals. So that's not nothing. But that really wasn't the only point of doing the research. The point of doing the research was to design media campaigns around each study. We didn't just want a study asking, have gays and lesbians undermined the British military, which allowed gays and lesbians to serve many years before we did. We wanted to do that study, but then have the New York Times report on that study on the front page. And so the real value added was not really doing the research, but doing the research and then getting media coverage of the research. And so the reason facts mattered is because we thought that over time we would be able to persuade generals and admirals and thought leaders and journalists and in turn the public at large, not by avoiding stories. We still featured stories of, when we released our study of the British military, we also gave the journalist a gay submariner who'd been kicked out of the Royal Navy for being gay and then let back in when the ban was lifted. So we emphasized the story, but a story about a gay submariner. Let me say it this way. We want our studies and our talking points to be used as aggressively as possible in Washington. Like, what's more credible? A New York Times story about a gay submariner in the British military who's doing a good job, or a story about a gay submariner in the British military who's doing a good job, and a study by the University of California that has interviewed every expert in the world on the topic and shows that gays and lesbians have helped the British military. So if you want someone in Congress to be able to use that article, the article and the research have to be paired. Like in the minds of a member of Congress, the study doesn't exist until it gets media coverage, but the journalist is more likely to cover the story if there's a research component and new data. It doesn't mean the new study will always get research, and it's quite hard to get media coverage of research, so we had to get clever about that over time. But the point is that we had to just drill the research into the public conversation again and again and again and again.
And one of my chief challenges with researchers are often you will ask them, what are the implications of your research? And they'll say, not my problem. Tenure, that's my problem. And being able to take that research and marry it to communications efforts and campaigns feels like a no-brainer, and a lot of folks don't seem to have brains. And you did. Well, so you did this like 3 times a year for 10 years. You're the Energizer Bunny of research and communications.
Yeah, we released 3 or 4 studies a year for 10 years and did really aggressive media campaigns around each one, and it pretty much worked every time. So we had about 35 different times we made national news at the level of like AP or Network News or New York Times or Washington Post with the message that, new research, gays and lesbians in the military is success, discrimination hurts the military. And so, and this, you want to talk about the tactics in the book. I think the second tactic was iteration or repetition. Yeah. So from a scholar's point of view, that was a very, very boring strategy because we were asking the same research question in every single study, and scholars don't like to ask the same research question in every single study. It's not interesting. Now, we asked the question in a different empirical context, so that was interesting. But from a theoretical sense, we weren't investigating anything new, and we knew what the answers to the research was likely to be, not because we cooked the books. And in fact, when we would discover evidence that showed that gays and lesbians and bisexuals hurt the military, we would, be very loud and do press releases about that. But the preponderance of evidence showed that we were right. And so doing research about that evidence would pretty much always turn up the same answer. But the reason that we had to iterate, which is something that scholars just hate doing, and even think tanks that are not, in universities, but it's hard to attract funding on just doing the same thing again and again. So I don't think people who don't use this strategy are stupid. I think there are good reasons for not using this strategy, but the importance of iteration is it's almost like an advertising strategy. The scholars already knew that gays and lesbians don't hurt the military, but we had to prevail in the court of public opinion. If you saw one Honda Motors commercial in your life, then when you would go to buy a car, you'd never even think of Honda. But if you see Honda Motors car commercials again and again your whole life, then there's a chance you'll buy a Honda. And it was the same with us. If you do one great study and get media coverage on it, that's not going to inform public policy or the public conversation or move polls. You have to find a way to get journalists to cover your message based on research again and again and again and again and again and again. Steady drip over time. That's what we found moved public opinion and moved grasstop and elite, thought leader opinion as well, and generals and admirals.
The energy with which you attacked that strategy, I think, is really amazing. We're going to be right back with Aaron Belkin right after this break, and we'll continue talking about his work. You're listening to Let's Hear It, a podcast about foundation and nonprofit communications hosted by Kirk Brown and Eric Brown. Let's Hear It is sponsored by the Communications Network, which connects, gathers, and informs the field of leaders working in communications for good. Because foundations and nonprofits that communicate well are stronger, smarter, and vastly more effective. You can find Let's Hear It online at letshearitcast.com or on Twitter at Let's Hear It Cast. Thanks for listening, and now back to the show. Welcome back to Let's Hear It. I'm sitting here with Aaron Belkin, the founding director of the Palm Center and one of the key strategists in the successful effort to get the U.S. to repeal the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. So the next part of your strategy was to recruit validators. Now that makes sense to almost everybody, that the right messenger is sometimes even more important, but at least as important as the right message. It seems to me that a high water mark or an important turning point was when the former head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Shalikashvili, wrote an op-ed calling for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was nothing more important than finding validators for our message. It's kind of the difference between nutrition scholar releases new study that shows that overconsumption of sugar causes diabetes versus former CEO of a sugar company cosigns or releases a statement or a study showing that overconsumption of sugar or former CEO of Coca-Cola or something like that, or McDonald's, sugar causes diabetes. So for us, I mean, I was at the time a University of California scholar. Our research, we were publishing our research in military journals, but the folks who oppose gays and lesbians and bisexuals in the military, even before the Palm Center did anything, I mean, literally we just kind of planted our flag in the ground and said, we're open for business, started referring to us as homosexual activists and San Francisco homosexual activists. So when they went to Congress to lie about the evidence and say that gays and lesbians hurt the military, they were scholars informing public policy with evidence. And when we just put a shingle out, we were homosexual activists from San Francisco. And so, we did lots of things to inoculate ourselves from that, that back and forth by having, distinguished scholars do our studies and publish in the best journals. But that game was always going to continue. And so the most important thing, or one of the most important parts of our tactics and strategy, was to find generals and admirals who would carry our message for us. And we spent a lot of money and a lot of time, years and years, looking for validators. And it was hard because, at the beginning of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there was a survey that showed something like 97% of generals and admirals supported Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so that changed when our partner organization, Service Members Legal Defense Network, they found 6 or 7 retired generals here and there to speak out from time to time. And then 3 retired generals came out of the closet in the New York Times and came out of the closet as gay men, and then one of those retired general and flag officers knew General Shalikashvili's neighbor. General Shalikashvili was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the neighbor was in PFLAG because they were a Marine Corps colonel and they had a kid who was gay or lesbian, I can't remember, or bi. Anyways, so over the course of, and we got an introduction to General Shalikashvili, and we held 4 meetings with General Shalikashvili. We flew gay service members to talk to him. We told him about the research. He met with some advocates. And so after a year, then we helped him publish a New York Times op-ed saying that he had been wrong about gays and lesbians, that it's actually discrimination that hurts the military, not gays and lesbians, that inclusion helps the military. And then that op-ed became, I would say, pretty much the most important document in the repeal conversation. We followed that up by spending about 2 years of staff time and $100,000 getting 104 other generals and admirals to sign a statement calling for the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that also got national news. And so we worked closely with military professors, former service members, current service members in some cases. So yeah, finding validators was a critical part of what we were doing. And
you had mentioned in your book that when you got the 104 generals, that there was a kind of a response to it by the far right, that you felt you were questioning out loud whether this was a tactic that backfired on you. Can you just chat about that a little?
Sure. I mean, yeah, we spent 2 years, $100,000, getting 104 generals and admirals. We didn't pay the generals and admirals. It's just in staff time. It cost a lot of money to reach out to get 104 generals, retired generals and admirals to say that, discrimination was hurting the military. And the other side just snapped its fingers and I'm sure had access to email lists of retired general and flag officers through probably the Retired Officers Association of America or something like that is my guess. And immediately got 1,000 former generals and admirals to sign a statement saying that gays and lesbians hurt the military. But even though they had 10 times more validators than we did, their statement didn't really have much of an impact because those validators weren't surprising for the message they were carrying. Now, I would argue if the other side had been able to get 10 gay lesbian activists to say that Don't Ask, Don't Tell should not be repealed, or that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was helping the military, that would be more persuasive than 1,000 generals and admirals carrying that message. Because the point is that the validator has to be carrying an unexpected message.
Your next strategy was to build from within, essentially get inside the other side's fortress, if you will, if you want to torture the metaphor. But you became guest professor and you lectured inside a number of military colleges and things like that. What was that like? How did you pull that off and what was the effect?
Yeah, it was hard to get in at first. And I really wanted to get in because the service academies are so important within military culture for thought leadership and just kind of networks of influencers. But you can't just kind of walk in the door. And we wrote to the heads of many military universities asking for invitations, and I think we got one response that just said no. Military universities often send their faculty to civilian conferences, and so I made friends with a West Point professor at an academic conference, and I waited 6 months, and then I was like, hey, could I just pay my own way to New York and kind of come on up to West Point? You could give me a tour. And he said, of course. And then I think it was 6 months later, I emailed and I was like, hey, if you think next year I could come at the Palm Center's expense, you won't have to pay anything, and just maybe, talk to a few cadets or faculty members. And yes, of course. And then over the years, the lectures got bigger and bigger until at one point I was lecturing something like 500 cadets at West Point. And over the years, I used to have an exact count, so I can't remember the exact number, but I gave something like 30 to 40 lectures at West Point and Annapolis Air Force Academy, the war colleges, and would go back year after year. And that was important for a few reasons. One of which is that I built up a list of about 100 current and former military faculty members who agreed with the research. And the presentations, especially in the military settings, were never advocacy presentations. They're always, all right, let's talk about military readiness. You care about military readiness. Let's look at what the research says. Is discrimination helping or hurting military readiness? So the folks who invited me weren't doing advocacy. They just wanted to make sure that their internal conversations were based on evidence. So those allies that I met and cultivated, they could take the research and take the presentations and have quiet conversations behind closed doors in places I could never get to. And over time, that really helped, and it helped so much that when the Pentagon finally did decide with Congress to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, they flew one of the people I had worked most closely with from the Air Force Academy to Washington and had that person temporarily assigned to the Pentagon for a year to write the Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal plan. And so, yeah, I mean, there's literature on, even what it takes to move policy in the church. And Mary Katzenstein wrote a book called Insider-Outsider Partnerships or whatever. But the point being that there are things outsiders can do that insiders can't, and there are things insiders can do that outsiders can't. And so you want to try to work together if possible.
And your fifth strategy was to expose hypocrisy, which just sounds like lots of fun. Do you have any favorite stories about how, when you exposed hypocrisy, that you really felt that you had, made some advances?
I could tell you a failed story.
Those are fun too.
I like this one, but so we won on our argument. You just couldn't, with a straight face, make the case that gays and lesbians hurt the military, especially after the Arabic linguist story that we broke. That cables for 9/11 had sat untranslated because we didn't have enough Arabic linguists, but they were firing Arabic linguists for being gay. That was the day when we broke that story, when the military lost to the public forever. So we won on our argument, but that didn't mean the policy was going to be repealed. But fast forward to 2010, and Barack Obama and members of Congress were trying to repeal the policy, which ultimately succeeded. But during Senate testimony, there was a retired 3 or 4-star general from the Marine Corps testified in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee that the Srebrenica massacre had happened because Dutch peacekeepers included gays and lesbians. If you can't connect the dots there, which is pretty weird dot connecting, but
I'm going to need a protractor and a sextant, but yeah.
Yeah, what he meant was gays and lesbians undermine the military. The Dutch peacekeepers were the military unit assigned to protect civilians in Srebrenica. The Dutch military allows gays and lesbians. Those gays and lesbians undermine unit cohesion. Therefore, the worst massacre since World War II up to the time happened because of gays and lesbians in the military. So you can't lift the American gay ban because we'd have the same problem. And Senator Levin, the former chairman of Senate Armed Services, he used to wear his glasses down by his nose, and he put them even lower. And he looked over his glasses. He's like, "Do you want to rephrase that?" And the general's like, "No." He's like, you sure about that?" And the general stuck by his guns. And so I just thought it would, the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and I think even the Dutch Prime Minister, immediately put out statements that said that, this guy was fucking nuts, and what the hell was, because, that's not a good look. It's, first of all, a fucking lie. And it's also not a good look for the Dutch military, that senior American military personnel are making that claim. But I thought it would be really, it's a very tragic and somber moment because the Srebrenica massacre was a human disaster. But This was so ridiculous. I thought it would be great if survivors groups would put out statements saying that the general was off his rocker, and I tried to get them to do that, and they wouldn't do it. So that was a failed effort to elevate hypocrisy, but it was fun to try.
Yeah, and the most tortured syllogism I think I've ever heard. Now, okay, so you win the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Then you went on a campaign to address the problem of trans people being kicked out of the military or not being able to get medical treatment and other things.
Yep.
So you went from the easy thing to the harder, or the impossible thing to the even more impossible thing, and you managed to pull that one off in 3 years. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I thought that one would take 15 years, and it ended up taking 3, although then Donald Trump came in and reinstated the transgender ban, and now Biden has reinstated inclusive policy. And I'm sure future Republican presidents will try to reinstate the transgender ban, and they will lie about the evidence to do so, just like Trump lied. The structure of that conversation was analogous to the Don't Ask, Don't Tell conversation, because defenders of discrimination were lying about the evidence and saying it was a different lie. So with gays, lesbians, and bisexuals, it was GLB troops undermine unit cohesion. And with trans troops, the lie was that trans troops are not medically ready to serve, and the military couldn't possibly provide health care for trans troops. And that's just complete bullshit. And so we used research to generate media headlines to show that the military was not telling the truth. And that opened up a space for repeal. It just happened a lot quicker. Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal gave us some tailwinds, as well as a policy that I did not work on, but the repeal of the combat exclusion rule that banned women from combat positions was also repealed during the trans military campaign. And that was important because it meant that anyone in any gender could do any job. And if that hadn't been the case, then there would have been all kinds of opposition arguments to repealing the trans ban, that you have a man serving in the Army, in the Rangers, Special Forces, and you find out that she's actually a trans woman. So what are we going to do about her job once she transitions? But that, all those arguments were off the table once the combat exclusion rule was lifted. So anyways, the strategy worked. The politics of trans rights nationally were changing, and we had some momentum from Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal. But the ultimate outcome of the conversation is yet to be determined, just because the Republicans clearly want to roll that back like they already did.
Okay, so now you got the trans situations sorted out, at least for the moment, at least under presidential decree. And now you're working on expanding the Supreme Court because you just don't like sleeping, I think, is what it is, because you just have too much energy. Can you talk a little bit about your work now to take back the court, I think is how you frame it?
Yeah, so I just got scared when Mitch McConnell stole the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has been sabotaging democracy for a generation in order to help the Republican Party win elections, to put it simply. I mean, that's why the Supreme Court dismantled the Voting Rights Act. That's why the Supreme Court dismantled campaign finance limitations. That's why the Supreme Court has blessed hyperpartisan gerrymandering. It's all, I don't think there's a smoky back room where John Roberts and Mitch McConnell sit down together to coordinate things, but they're all acting in tandem on behalf of plutocrats to hurt everyday Americans. And when the court was stolen, that, to my mind, put us in a situation that was unique in American history, where 3 things came together simultaneously in a way that had not happened before. We had doses of all 3 things, but not simultaneously, at least in my knowledge of American history, which is, first of all, you had a stolen court. Second of all, you had a court that was proactively sabotaging democracy, blocking black people from the polls. And then third of all, you had a court that was clearly unwilling to let future presidents and Congresses deal with planetary emergencies like climate catastrophe. And there was an obvious solution. This was 2018, so Trump was still president. But there was an obvious solution, which is that if the Democrats were to come back into power, they could expand the Supreme Court. And there are counter-arguments to that, but when you look at the counter-arguments for 5 seconds, they fall apart. Like, they don't make any sense. They look good on paper, but they don't withstand scrutiny. But the problem was that the idea of court expansion had been taboo for 81 years since 1937 because there was a conventional wisdom that Roosevelt had failed to expand the Supreme Court. That's not the way we and other historians read the history. I mean, we believe that the preponderance of evidence shows that President Roosevelt's effort to expand the Supreme Court frightened the court into upholding New Deal legislation, which is why we still have the Social Security Act. So we don't see that as a failure at all. But we had to find a way to kind of get this idea to not be taboo so that Democrats could threaten to expand the Supreme Court and ultimately enact court expansion. So I'm really proud, fast forward 3 years to today. So at the time when the project launched, we had 0 members of Congress in favor of the idea and 0 organizations. Today we have 51 members of Congress, including Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Tina Smith and Senator Ed Markey, supporting court expansion bills in Congress. And we have 103 organizations, including very powerful organizations like SEIU, calling for expansion. And every time the court does something terrible, momentum grows. And that dynamic is now in place to continue into the future. So that's what Take Back the Court does.
Do you have a prediction? When will we be expanding the court to 13 seats? I
think that if civilization still exists and there are historians in the future, I think they will look back at this era. And I think the key question is, it's not really just court expansion, but it's, will Republicans drive democracy into a ditch before Democrats unrig the system? So Democrats need to get rid of the filibuster, pass very aggressive democracy legislation that would ban voter suppression and gerrymandering and dark money and grant statehood to DC and Puerto Rico and other things like that, and expand the court to protect that legislation. Because if they pass the legislation but don't expand the court will kill the legislation. So the question is, will the Democrats restore democracy, or will the Republicans permanently kill it? I would say the Republicans, if I had to bet, I would say the Republicans will kill democracy and we will end up with an authoritarian system. But I hope I'm wrong, and I'm doing what I can to make that, prevent that from happening.
Well, you are the most optimistic pessimist I've ever met. And really, I think a teacher to me. I've been following your work and learning from you for many, many years. I hope that we've introduced you to smart people out there who will continue to learn from you and to build on what you've created. Aaron Belkin, it's such a pleasure and an honor to have this conversation with you. Thank you so very much.
My pleasure. I really appreciate it.
And we're back. So once again, I can't help but saying that these interviews just make me think I've wasted my life. These are people of real consequence that have done real things.
You know what, Kirk? It's true. Yeah. You've wasted your life, and so have I, because standing next to Aaron.
What do you have to show for it? Nothing. Nothing.
Nothing.
So I want to jump to the end of the story for a second, because I feel like Aaron has once again decided to do the impossible. And let's go through the book and the 5 strategies and Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because that's really just such exciting and important work to hear about. But now Aaron jumps to, let's take back the Supreme Court.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. No. His argument, I think, is a really interesting one, which was when the Supreme Court, when they determined that there would be 9 justices in the Supreme Court, is because there were 9 circuits in the courts, and now there are 13 circuits, and so why not have 13 justices? It's not as though it's not in the Constitution. This is something that is changeable. So.
Well, and you start feeling the presence of the kind of strategy Aaron works with, because I feel like I know more about the Supreme Court as a result of all of this work to rejigger it than I'd never thought about it before, right? And so all of a sudden, just in your daily life, you're starting to get bit by bit, piece by piece, the building blocks of this awareness of oh, why is it this way? Oh, what are the impacts of this? Oh, how does the court actually serve the few versus the many? And so again, I mean, another impossible task, but this step-by-step, bit-by-bit process that Aaron is describing, it just feels so right. It just feels like this is what the work has to look like. But jump me then back to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And again, I always like to ask you from the context of somebody who's sat in these seats within major foundations. I can only imagine the challenge Aaron would have had going out to find resources to take on maybe one of the most impossible tasks ever, which is, let's start addressing rights and equity issues just squarely in the context of the military. I mean, how would you imagine how difficult that was for Aaron to do that work?
There were a few funders who were funding things around marriage equality and undoing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There were a few. There weren't many. And the few that did it were resolute and incredibly patient and understood that these things take time. And I think for any funder out there who's working on an issue that matters, you have to understand that in many instances, these things take time. Also, that change is not linear. It's not like we're going to get a little better this year and a little better the year after that and a little better the year after that. In many instances, you're flatlining for a long period of time, and then some brief window opens and you go diving through it and you can achieve great things. And as Aaron said, that he didn't think that he was going to be able to secure trans rights for people serving in the military for decades, and it happened in 3 years. So some of these things happen as a result of just kind of the political planets align. And you have to be ready. And so that's, again, one of these real arguments for patience as a funder, to make sure that you have people with resources who are ready to go, are ready to respond, and I would say even at least as importantly, ready to defend your wins. Because a lot of folks say, okay, well, they win, they roll up shop and they go away. And I'll tell you what, Aaron is still out there banging away, ensuring that these rights stay won. And as you already saw, the Trump administration undid the trans, the reversal of the trans ban, and then the Biden administration put it back. So these things are never fully won, and you have to be there ready for when that day happens that somebody attempts to undermine your victories. Just look at what's likely or could possibly happen with Roe versus Wade. So, patience is the watchword here.
Well, and the instinct, the strategic sensibility, because, you applaud Aaron as one of the best and greatest communication strategists that you've ever met. And that comes out from the very first words of this interview when he starts talking about why the military, because again, the notion of, LGBTQ plus rights within the context of the military, just, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it just would have been not unheard of. Like, you would never even want to introduce that conversation in that setting. And Aaron's done the work to say, and this is the systems thinking part of it, right? He's saying, actually, if you want to talk about citizenship and rights, you talk about contracts and you talk about military service. And so let's go there. Let's have that conversation first, and then we'll actually build an umbrella of rights around the rest of these considerations. And I think that these campaigns, because there's a parallel campaign on the marriage equality side, right? Where we're talking about, hey, if we're going to have rights, let's actually treat people like people who have rights in all these settings, right?
Exactly.
And go to the most important settings. I just think that's genius. But I also think that work is so hard to advocate for before it's been shown that it can work, right? I can't imagine walking into a room when this is first being hatched and saying, we're actually going to work in the military setting first. Here's why. I think that insight is just so profound. It's amazing.
Yeah. Aaron also takes on some of the sacred cows of left-leaning political communication strategy, like George Lakoff and framing. He just goes right at Lakoff. And I mean, he makes a really great point. If the other side is lying, you have to call out the lies. You can't just pretend those lies didn't happen and come up with your own new way of framing an issue. You just have to call the lie. And by the way, Aaron Aaron has been the saltiest of interviewees on Let's Hear It. Hey, look, after 30 seconds of Ted Lasso, you've heard more F-bombs than Aaron dropped in the whole episode, so I think we're probably okay. It's, same thing with research. We've been told that research doesn't matter, that facts don't matter, and what he did was he used research as an opportunity to advance a media narrative, and that these two things went hand in hand. And he also had folks that he understood that he wasn't always the messenger, that he got generals out there and the former chair of the Joint Chiefs. So these things are, he really understands how you build a movement, how you make a case, and how you how you win. And
Yeah.
like I said when I was talking to him, get the book. It's an ebook. It's $5. It's called How We Won. You can get it on Amazon, and it is, I mean, it's worth its weight in gold.
So 5 strategies mapped out in How We Won for why this campaign around Don't Tell was successful. And, you know, when you guys were talking, I was thinking about these words we describe sometimes when we do communications work. We talk about goals, and then you talk about strategy, and then you talk about tactics. But it also felt like there was a fourth dimension that was kind of the piece that Aaron kept on going back to, which was just the absolute day in, day out persistence and resilience required to make that work go. And I thought that framing conversation around target the opposition's lies was so interesting. And I will say, right, that's very unusual to hear somebody say George Lakoff did a lot of damage to the progressive community, right? But then I think that there's a thread in there which is like, let's learn the right lesson when we're having these conversations, right? Let's not take away the wrong lesson. And the wrong lesson, as Eric is talking about, or as Aaron is talking about it, is let's not be afraid to tell the truth of the policies that we're supporting. And I have to say, that was like a lightning bolt of just clarity from the heavens, because it's true. It's like, let's just say what's true. Let's try that. What do you think about that? I mean, it's just, I love it.
I totally agree. And it doesn't take much of a leap to understand how you would adapt much of what Aaron's strategies have been to any host of other issues, whether it's climate, whether it's women's reproductive health and rights, race, all these things. So these are really important lessons. And I also think that one of the assets that Aaron really brings is just indefatigability. This guy does not rest. And that's really important. And he doesn't get bored with his own message, which is one of the, I think, cardinal sins of communications, is that we say something a few times and then we get bored. It's like, everybody knows that. Let's just move on and come up with some new way to talk about the thing that we're saying.
Right.
And he never wavered from his core message, which is that gays and lesbians should be able to serve openly and proudly in the military, that discrimination harms the military, it harms our democracy, it harms our military readiness, all of those things. And he just never stopped on that. And other folks, they'll try and find new novel ways of saying their thing, and what they end up doing is undercutting their own power. But because people forget what it was that they were saying in the first place. You knew exactly what Aaron was working on. You knew why he thought it mattered. He took every single possible opportunity to say the same thing, often using different kinds of evidence, but it was all making the same point. That's such a powerful lesson, and it's something that we really, really, really need to listen to.
No, it's so difficult, and there's so many reasons why it's so hard to stick there, and funder fatigue being one of them, right? Because very few funders will say, "Oh, look, just copy and paste last year's proposal. As long as you have evidence of success, let's keep at it, right? We're gonna update it. We're gonna do it differently in today's context, but the underlying work is going to be, we're just going to keep hitting on this again and again." And it actually makes me wonder, what do you call that? Like, is that persistence? Is that like, hey, well, here's the playbook and we're going to keep rolling it out and keep working it and working it? What is that? Is that a goal? Is that a strategy or a tactic? Or is it something else? Or is it the bow that wraps it all around? Because I feel like sometimes when we have these conversations about different tactical interventions, different strategic frameworks, hey, how are our goals shifting? Sometimes the piece we're missing is that message discipline, that repetition of approach, that's actually the hard-earned work of actually securing change. And it's almost like it's like so necessary, but since it's kind of the oxygen in the room, we kind of miss it a little bit because it's invisible. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, what it is a precondition for success.
Yeah.
That you have to be willing to be there for the long term. You have to be patient. The other thing is, and I think, you say you have to show continued success. That's not always possible. What you have to do is have a firm conviction that you're right, and be willing to stay at it for a long time because you're right, and because the thing that you need to do has to happen. Yeah. And that's what happens. And you may find that you made tactical errors along the way, but that your basic premise is correct, and that a way to get to that to that end state can happen. And
Mhm.
you know, we have no guarantees in any of this stuff that we're going to win, but you have to believe that you're right, and you have to be willing to hang in there for a really long time.
Well, and I loved, and we'll move off this, but in that discussion, you had that brief exchange about why aren't progressives just saying high taxes are a good thing? You know, and let's do a decade of public education work to firmly cement that idea. And I think it's that combo package sometimes that we miss, you know, that surprising message that feels counterintuitive and scary. You don't just throw that once out like a little asteroid burning out in the atmosphere once. You actually work at the stuff time, day after day, year after year. And that's what really creates the change. But, you know, the last thing, and I know we're almost at time, but he talks about facts mattering. You guys had a really interesting conversation about that, how they leverage, you know, this research agenda and push that out, and talked about validators and the power of, you know, the generals and the folks that they found to validate this perspective, and that 100 of the validators carrying an unsuspected message was more powerful than 1,000 validators, right? So
yeah, I mean, the way I think about this is that if 1,000 dogs bark, who cares? If 104 dogs fly, that's interesting.
That's right. No, that's great. You know, and then he talks about exposing hypocrisy. But the last thing I want to talk about, the notion of building from within. And, you know, again, Aaron going to military colleges and being a professor, not as an activist, but just saying, these are the facts. Here's the data. Again, that instinct and that willingness to say, you know, I'm just going to carry this message wherever it belongs at great personal risk, always, most likely. But the bravery and the courage that goes along with that, plus the clarity of thought that that's a step I'm going to take. You know, it sounds so simple, built from within. But when you really look at what that looks like, there's real courage at work here, you know, to say, hey, I'm going to actually stand up and carry this message.
Yeah. You know, the interesting thing about the military is that it is a very, it is a regimented institution, right. and it is not beyond the realm of possibility that somebody who's advocating to undo Don't Ask, Don't Tell would be invited to speak in front of a military college. It's actually not impossible. Right. It would be harder to talk about climate change inside the Hudson Institute, perhaps.
Sure.
But I think that the general premise is correct, which is you go anywhere and everywhere to share your message with anyone who will listen. Yeah. And even if those people are not going to agree with you, or if they're going to, you know, you're not going to persuade them, you need to get out there and keep making these arguments. And right now, of course, a lot of folks are like, I don't talk to the other side. Hell with them. You know, they're crazy. And on the one hand, emotionally, that feels very satisfying. But it may well be that you end up making arguments that people are persuaded by, or are softened to, or you build relationships on things, maybe thin layers of common ground that you can find. I'm still not giving up on the fact that we can find some areas of common interest and take advantage of that. And there are a lot of folks I will never agree with on some very fundamental things, but I can probably find something to agree on, and to be able to get into those places and have those conversations and try your best to build those relationships feels like it's worth it. That at the very least you have to explore it. Because in the end, we're just fighting these it's like trench warfare, and we're winning 5 yards and digging a new trench and then losing it back again, and no one's really making any headway.
Yeah. Well, you know, you didn't talk about it explicitly, but it seems like what's implied in what Aaron was working on with Don't Ask, Don't Tell was success, like ensuring that our military is successful and can accomplish its mission using the best and the brightest and the most capable people possible. So why are we not allowing the best and the brightest and the most capable to participate because of these other distinctions? And that conversation around readiness and success, you know, that people from across the board who have that consideration around the military might find common ground there, right?
Yeah.
They just have to be convinced.
That's right. And when he made the argument about the linguists who were fired, and then we had 9/11, it was an extremely powerful argument. He pretty much said, like, we basically won with that one. Wow. That was what it took, because that trumped everything. That trying to protect the United States against terrorism is more important than keeping gays and lesbians out of the military.
Well, Aaron Belkin, director of the Palm Center, on his own website with all of his writing at aaronbelkin.org, and on Twitter at Aaron Belkin. Aaron, wow. Thank you. Eric, wow. Thank you.
That was really fun. Like I said, I just admire Aaron so much. He's such a generous guy. He's really smart.
Yeah.
He's someone we all can learn from.
That was Aaron Belkin on Let's Hear It. We'll see you next time. Okay, everybody, that's it for this episode. Please let us know if you have any thoughts about what you heard today or people we should have on this show, and that definitely includes yourself. And we'd like to thank
John Beltrano, our enthusiastic production assistant.
John Ali, the tuneful and inspiring composer of our theme music.
Our sponsors, the Communications Network and the Lumina Foundation.
And please check out Lumina's terrific podcast, Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, and you can find that at luminafoundation.org.
We certainly thank today's guest and, of course, all of you.
And most importantly, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Oh, no. Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Okay, everybody, until next time.
Let's hear it. Ready when you are.
Okay. This is okay. You're just so frustrated. You're so prepared. You're just like, I'm working with an amateur. I can't believe how
Can't work like this.
how far I've fallen. I was on broadcast television.
That's right.
I was on a network. And now I'm with the dork in my dining room who can't stop laughing. Okay, here we go. Okay.